Hello, well, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to have this incredible group of panelists for this conversation today. We're just going to go ahead and get started. So I hope people are filtering into the call. My name is Danielle Gilbert. I'm a fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy and International Security at the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. I'm also a fellow with an organization called the Bridging the Gap Project that we're going to be talking a little bit about today. And I'm involved in the peace science community. I love attending peace science conferences. And the conversation today really came out of a conversation that some of us on the panel have been having about how there's not as much overlap between the peace science community and the Bridging the Gap community as I've seen in some of my other scholarly networks. And so as a scholar, I've thought about the competing explanations for why there might not be so much overlap between these communities, and we can talk about what some of those reasons might be. But in the off chance that it's just about a lack of familiarity with Bridging the Gap or guidance about how one might engage your scholarly work with the public, with policymakers, with lots of other different types of non-scholarly communities, we wanted to provide an open invitation to talk about that kind of public and policy engagement. So that is the genesis of the conversation today, and we're so glad that you have joined us for it. Just a quick primer on Bridging the Gap as an organization that we're going to be talking about just a little bit today. It started 15 years ago by Naazneen Barma, who's on this call, and some of her classmates and advisors. And the organization really started with the motivation of training scholars and encouraging, empowering scholars to ask policy relevant research questions and to engage with policymakers and with the public. There are a few kind of centerpiece programs of the Bridging the Gap project that I'm sure will come up in the conversation today, including an annual workshop for PhD students called the New Era Workshop that deals with some professionalization and also with a scenario analysis exercise. There's an annual workshop for postdocs and faculty at all levels called the International Policy Summer Institute, otherwise known as IPSC, that deals with a lot of the nuts and bolts of policy engagement across lots of different kinds of communities. There is a Bridging the Gap book series at Oxford University Press. And recently, the organization has been putting on what we call New Voices workshops that bring together junior and mid-career scholars and policymakers for a targeted discussion on a specific policy topic or question. So those are just some of the hallmark programs of Bridging the Gap Project, the organization. And we'd love to answer any of your questions about that and the much broader question of gap bridging, policy engagement, speaking to the public as a whole. So with that, I would love to turn it over to my fellow panelists to hear a little bit about their own story and what they think about these topics. So I will turn first to Chelsea, and each of the panelists will introduce themselves to talk about their research, their relationship to Bridging the Gap, the organization, and relationship to Bridging the Gap as a concept by way of introduction. So Chelsea, over to you.
Hey, everyone. Thank you first and foremost to Danny for bringing us all together in this format. This is an incredibly exciting conversation. So I am an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, and my research broadly looks at I would call it the political economy of political violence. So my work looks at rebel group financing and the decisions that rebels make with regards to how that financing occurs, as well as increasingly more about criminality and external price shocks to the assets that criminal groups have and how that affects things like criminal governance and violence and broader implications. I have some work as well on perceptions of repression in the United States and on sanctions and money laundering. So I'm a little bit all over, but all what I would consider broadly political economy and violence. Let's see, I am a long time, at least long in my career, participant in the peace science community. So it's the first conference that I ever went to. It remains pretty much the only one that I put on my calendar every year. And I very much have loved being a part of it. And so I also now run the online peace science, what we're having right now. So it's wonderful to be able to see these things come together in this format. And I look forward to there being more, frankly, collaboration across these two groups. My introduction to Bridging the Gap, I've been aware of it for quite some time and always really admired what the organization has done. I guess to the concept of Bridging the Gap, I sort of did this a little bit backwards. So before I went to graduate school, I worked with the U.S. Institute of Peace as a research sort of consultant, one of those like fresh out of undergrad kind of positions. But I was working on countering violent extremism with them, and I loved that format. I thought it was great. I was in the middle of grad school applications at the time, and it really confirmed for me that I wanted to look into these issues at a broader level. So I would say from the get-go that my decision to go to graduate school and to engage in this career has been shaped by wanting to be active in policy, or at least wanting to have policy-driven research. And that maintains a priority, or is a priority still for me today. But more recently, I went to the OPSC summer program, which was absolutely fantastic. So if anyone on this call is thinking about attending or looking in the future about things they'd like to do, I wholeheartedly recommend. I'm sure we'll talk in more detail about it, but I would say that, so I am kind of approaching the end of my tenure clock, and it's given me so many great ideas for things that I would like to reprioritize in my career as I move forward. So I'm going to stop there. I've been talking for a while, but it's like I said, it's because I'm very excited. So thanks again, Neil.
That's awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Danny. I'm excited to be here because I'm passionate about the subject, but also because this is a group of people I just really like a lot, and maybe those things are correlated, right? so, so I'm Emily Ritter. I'm a associate professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. I do research on human rights outcomes, and in particular, the relationship between repression and dissent actions and social movements. And I was a member of the OPSC cohort last year. So last summer is when I joined the Bridging the Gap crowd with Chelsea. And so that's the programming I've attended. But my relationship with gap bridging as a concept is focused mostly on connecting research outcomes with public audiences rather than policymakers. And that's not to say that, of course, human rights and protest actions aren't really important in the policy space, but I also have been very convicted that these are things that we should be talking to people whose rights are being violated, or the people who are protesting, or the people who are trying to change things for good. And so I actually, I own a comic studio, and we create comic art and sequential art for researchers to convey their research ideas through storytelling and narrative process. So we can either tell the stories of real people that you've interviewed and worked with, or we can tell stories of fictional people who are engaging in the space that your research is occurring. And so I also am a permanent contributor to the Political Violence at a Glance blog, or online magazine, and there I focus on, again, like really accessible writing to try and connect political science research with the community. And I especially write on like fictional narratives a lot, and how those are connected to the work that we do.
That's great. Thank you so much, Emily. And finally to Naz.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks everyone. It's great to be here with you all this morning, including our participants. I equally am really enthusiastic being in this room with the four people three other people on screen here. I'm Naazneen Barma. I'm an associate professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. I'm the Scrivener Chair of Public Policy, and I direct the Scrivener Institute of Public Policy. And my research is on a kind of a range of things around the political economy of development and state building. And so I've some work on peace building and state building in post-conflict countries, some work on the foreign aid and political economy of development more broadly, focused in Southeast Asia, and then a little bit of work on global governance and kind of how the international kind of policy around development and state building is enacted in the developing and conflict-affected world. So like Chelsea, kind of many different things, but all kind of around political economy. Danny, you asked us to talk about our research methods, and I think that's an interesting question in the context of bridging the gap. We'll get to kind of sort of how that comes in to some extent. My work has been almost exclusively qualitative. So I do a lot of in-depth case study work, and sort of process tracing and comparative case methods. And for better for worse, I think that's part of the reason why I haven't been as engaged in the peace science community as I would have liked to have been in some ways. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit as well. I've kind of long admired and wanted to be more involved, so I'm thrilled to be here today. And many friends who are kind of are both in both circles, the Bridging the Gap and the peace science communities. As Danny mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders, a proud co-founder of the Bridging the Gap. The organization started in 2006 at Berkeley when I was a graduate student, with a couple of other colleagues and our advisor, Steve Weber. And in partnership with the Carnegie Corporation of New York, we should mention, they've been our longtime funders and kind of really incredible supporters as we've kind of thought through how this work has evolved over the last 15 years or so. And the reason why we started Bridging the Gap in 2006, myself, Eli Ratner, who was now the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific, Brent Durbin, who's a professor at Smith College, Matt Koenig, who's at Georgetown at the Atlantic Council, along with Steve, is that all of us had experience in the policy world before starting our PhD programs, and all wanted to actually be able to talk about that while we were also kind of, working on our PhDs and kind of conducting our research, and felt that in 2006 we didn't have the space to really do that. And so we wanted to make the space for ourselves to be able to have these conversations, to kind of claim proudly that we were interested in doing policy relevant work, and even that some of us were interested in potentially careers in the policy world moving forward. And I think one thing that's changed a lot over the last 10 or 15 years is kind of how openly people kind of talk about those designs, and that's been something that's been really rewarding with regard to the organization. And I'll just say, kind of just to wrap up here, my own kind of gap bridging experience has been less in terms of kind of policy relevant writing, and less in terms of the kind of public engagement that Emily was just describing. But I've worked as a policymaker. I worked for 6 years at the World Bank, kind of in between and after graduate school. And kind of my research is very much informed by those development practitioner experiences. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I've got a series of questions for our panelists that I hope will be informative for our participants and for people who might watch this later online. So I'm going to start with a big question. Why engage? And for our panelists, they can answer this however they want, whether it's about engaging with certain groups, whether it's why they engage or why they think others might engage. So I will turn this first question to start with Emily.
Thanks. So at the beginning of my career from grad school into my first couple of years on the tenure track, I always felt like it was really important to be objective as a scientist, right? That we shouldn't be weighing in on debates, we shouldn't be making normative statements or suggestions, because that would taint the idea of the rigor or the credibility of the science that we're doing. But when I moved to the University of California, Merced, that's an area of California that struggles with poverty, struggles with inequality and over policing and mass incarceration. And migrations and migrant rights, undocumented students, and there are just so many people there whose everyday lives are experiencing rights violations and wanting to do something about it. And I felt like the work that I was doing on protests and human rights actions were not speaking to the people most affected by those violations. And so I started to write more for blogs and really wanted to find a way to connect with people more broadly. And my husband is a comic book artist. And we have worked together to learn more about how narrative and storytelling can really change people's minds and create calls to action. And when combined with rigorous research, that's really amazing, right? And so we have worked for a while now on creating comics for expressing these ideas to the public. So those are essentially really personal reasons for wanting to do this. I feel like it was something that benefited me in my well-being and in my value for the work that I do. And to be able to connect with people in this way is really exciting. I would say that it was, it's a lot of, I mean, the way I went about it was to create a company, and that's not something I would recommend for anyone who's not tenured, but I feel that the engagement part of this career is something that you can do at any point in your career, right? People think that they have to wait until tenure, and I don't think that that's something that you need to do. The more you engage with policymakers or people who are experiencing what you study, the more you learn about the thing that you study. And the more that you get interesting research questions or access to data or access to interviewees or research subjects, you'll figure out what are the right questions to ask. And so I think it benefits your career at any time in your career if that's something that is making you hesitate to bridge the gap, right? This is the work that we are doing. That's why we do it, because it's relevant for the research that we do. And so engaging in that doesn't hinder you or ruin your prospects. It should only bolster what you're doing.
Thanks, Emily. Over to Naz.
No, thank you. And thanks, Emily. That's really interesting. And I think, I was similarly going to say that I'm a political scientist because I care about the real world, right? I think that probably is true for all of us. I heard Chelsea say it a little bit earlier. And so, I engage and I think, why, and my answer to why engage is that it's a way of contributing to the public good, right? I think we do, so much of academia can be so kind of, kind of keeping our heads down and meeting our kind of professional, milestones and so on. That for me, similarly, kind of being engaged with the public and in policy conversations is about kind of broadening that aperture and having kind of these different, parts of my brain activated. I think being engaged, helps us as scholars, contribute to better informed policy making. So a lot of the conversations that we have at Bridging the Gap is to think about, and in particular, when we bring together policymakers and scholars in these kind of, structured workshops around kind of particular policy questions, is to kind of ask ourselves, how are we as scholars contributing to the decision-making that policymakers kind of actually have to make on a day-to-day kind of operational and strategic basis? And how can we sort of convey, what we know, the deep knowledge that we have as social scientists about kind of causal relationships and, contextual and context and so on. How can we kind of convey that to policymakers? So better informing policy. And as Emily was saying a little bit ago too, the commitment to sort of public engagement is something that I think is an important reason to think about engaging. And I will just say also that there's so many different ways to be engaged, right? I think there's the op-ed in the Washington Post, there's the Foreign Affairs article, there's being on TV, being on the radio, and then there's like going to your local Rotary Club or speaking to high school students, and all of those things are bridging, right? And I think that sometimes we, when we think about what bridging looks like, we may not be kind of conceptualizing that whole range of things that we could be doing. The last thing I'll say kind of in regard to this question is this is a selfish reason. I think bridging makes me a better scholar and a better teacher, right? Certainly a better teacher. I hope a better scholar, because I'm actually kind of out there in the real world, kind of asking questions that practitioners and policymakers are actually asking. And then I'm going to say one more thing. I said that was the last thing, but one more thing. A lot of the work that I've done in terms of case study research has been interviewing, research subjects out in the world, in the developing world in particular. And when I was at the World Bank, especially, I was doing similar research as I do now with my scholarly hat on. We interviewed a lot of people who asked us, what will we get back from this, right? How will we benefit from the time that we're spending with you? And because we do this all the time, we talk to all of you scholars and all of you world bankers and UN people and so on, and we never get anything back. And I think it's incumbent upon us, as Emily was just saying as well, to kind of to be able to kind of share back to the communities on which we are conducting research.
Thank you so much, Naz. And finally to Chelsea.
Yeah. So first off, sorry if my internet connection is a little bit funky today, but just as a preface to that. So I wanted to follow up on something that Naz briefly touched on right towards the end, where as I mentioned, the teaching aspect here. So I think for me, that's kind of an underrated component of bridging or engaging in this sort of activity. And it's something that I've noticed changing as I continue in this career as an educator. So I think so one of my favorite classes to teach is a class on political violence broadly. It's sort of like revolution and political violence. And I have incorporated quite a large degree of discussion about, like, if you were a policymaker, what would you do here? They do a policy brief now. These are all things that, especially in the wake of OPSC, I've really kind of like amplified trying to do these things. And it's not that we always come to great solutions. In fact, usually they leave the room feeling pretty frustrated that they can't get to exactly what they want to say or exactly what they need to do. But I'm aware that many of my students will not go on to do the PhD, and they will not go on to do what I'm doing. But a lot of them, voice some kind of interest in the State Department, in working with an NGO, in doing some other kind of research in the private sector. And I just think it's very important for them to acknowledge or to walk away from college with an understanding that their faculty are doing this not just because, we think it's really cool to exist in the ivory tower and ask these big questions, but because we're asking the questions because we want to see some kind of real world change. And of course, that may be a really long, gradual, sort of way to experience that change. But that has been something that has really, really, I would say, been rewarding for me. And again, sometimes the most rewarding part is when students say, wait, but how is this that tough, right? But they come into the class thinking it's not necessarily that tough. So I think that's been really cool. And then certainly, I would also second something that Emily mentioned about, I think there's really ways to boost your career by doing these sorts of things. I don't think it means that you have to, spend an entire year doing a fellowship. It's wonderful if you can, that's awesome. But if you can, every article that you read, if you can translate that in some way for a public audience via some kind of medium, that just gets a wider audience for you. So even if you're looking at this from a what's in it for me perspective, I have found that having to translate those ideas, so I'm largely a quantitative scholar, so trying to take it out of what are my, lovely plots coming out of this page and trying to make that into how would I tell my grandmother about this? Or how would I tell someone who, doesn't understand the connection between commodities and violence and criminality? That's been really super rewarding for me. It's connected me back to honestly why I started doing this in the first place.
Really
just have one
tremendous
more
answers.
thought.
Yeah, go
Sorry,
for
I
it,
just
Emily.
had one more thought on this, which is that granting institutions very often want you to focus on broader impacts. And broader impacts are how you connect what you do with someone in the real world. So whether that is policymakers, it's storytelling, it's going to K through 12 classrooms and talking about the things that you do, or developing curriculum for students. Those are all broader impacts. And so getting grants also helps your career. So think about that.
Can I just like foot stomp that, Emily? I think it's so important, and I don't know, kind of in the peace science community, how much it is kind of North American or international, but that is even more the case in so much of the rest of the world, right? So
Yeah.
the UK has its kind of impact framework. The Australian government does too, and we don't have that sort of as structured here in the United States. But absolutely, grant making organizations really want to see that.
Tremendous answers all around. You have convinced me I should engage. It's good for the world. It's good for my career. It's good for my students. It's good for everybody. So why shouldn't I do it? What are the risks? What are the downsides? What are the things we need to keep in mind to make sure that we are doing this ethically and responsibly? I'll start with Naz.
Thanks, Danny. And I think you used the two words there that I was going to kind of start off with, being ethical and being responsible, right? I think for a long time, when we started Bridging the Gap, there was this sense of like, well, we just have to do more of this, right? And that was kind of what the first push of the organization was, that not enough bridging is being done, by scholars and kind of connecting with the policy community. And more now, as you look at the overarching Bridging the Gap work that the Carnegie Corporation has funded a lot of, but a lot of other organizations are involved with now, people have started asking this question about how do we do it responsibly and ethically. And I will point to my colleagues at the C Center here at the University of Denver that run a project on responsible public engagement. They have a fantastic website, which actually has a series of questions asked by folks like us, right, who are kind of struggling with questions around the ethics of engaging in policymaking and in public conversations, in terms of doing contract work with multinational corporations, for government, and so on and so forth. All of the different ways, again, that you can and people do bridge. And a panel of experts kind of offers a series of answers around some of those questions. It's a really great, I'll find it in a second and pop it into the chat. It's a great resource. I'll also point to a piece that our colleague at Bridging the Gap, Jim Goldgeier, and I wrote, and Emily illustrated for us in International Affairs with a beautiful comic late last year entitled "How Not to Bridge the Gap." And a couple of things that I would emphasize from that piece is that Jim and I talked about the 4 I's, and there are two I's that I'll kind of emphasize here. One is the seeking of influence, right? So when we're trying to bridge the gap, we're trying to influence policymaking. We're trying to influence the way that the public kind of view a contemporary policy issue, something that's going on in the world. And I think, the more and more that I've personally been involved in this endeavor, the more circumspect I've become about in many ways, the power that we have to shape conversation around these things, right? And so Anjali Dayal, who's at Fordham University in New York, had this great phrase a couple of years ago at IPSC when she was attending, where she said, it's incumbent upon scholars to communicate informed uncertainty, right? So much of the time, what policymakers want from us, and Chelsea was alluding to this a few minutes ago, they want answers. Tell me how, your scholarship helps me do the thing that I have to do today or tomorrow. And as scholars, so much of what we do is find conditional ways to answer those questions. And to the extent that we can communicate that uncertainty, to the extent to which we can communicate how certain things happen under certain contexts and don't happen in others, that I think is something that is a risk we have to kind of mitigate. We have to mitigate by conveying informed uncertainty. And the other piece of it is just the other I that I will emphasize is integrity. Again, it's easy to get Janice Grostein, who's at the University of Toronto, security studies scholar, has talked about how when you're really in proximity to power, it's easy to become seduced by that, right? It's easy to say, I want to stay in this room and in this conversation. And it's easy. And I don't mean, it's not, there's no malintent often with any of this. It's easy to just say the thing that you think people want to hear. Again, it's incumbent upon us as scholars, when we engage responsibly, to speak truth to power, even if that means that we end up getting kicked out of the room. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Naz. Let's go to Chelsea.
Okay, sorry, Danny, I think I lost you a little bit when you asked the question. Just to clarify, you're checking in on ethical engagement, right? And okay,
Yeah.
just making sure.
And also, why not engage? Like, what are the reasons
Sure.
that someone shouldn't do it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of this comes down to a little bit of the methodological question. As Naz pointed out, I would say that the majority of the peace science community tends to be sort of quantitative, large N observational work, right? And it's something that is the work that I do. So I'm certainly not condemning that by any means. But I often feel a little bit concerned about the implications, or really the deep interpersonal or even causal relationships in my work, because I don't do field work. That's not something that I have experience in. And, some of this is a little bit of kind of imposter syndrome type stuff, but some of this is a very real concern about when I'm just looking at numbers on the page, what does that mean in relation to how that would be applied, or relation to even just the conclusions that I'm drawing. And so I think that this is unfortunately not going to be a strong piece of advice as much as just a general caveat, I guess. I am sometimes wary about making really kind of in-depth or even claiming to be super informed on some of the policy advice that I would possibly be able to provide. So I think that's a little bit of sort of, like I said, a caveat that I would mention, and something that I think, while I certainly want to see the peace science community become more involved in these ways, it's something that we may have to grapple with, right? So in what ways can we really probe our own work to make sure that the claims that we're making are valid, that they are not harmful, that they are actually getting to, sort of the mechanisms at hand. I was recently at a conference where a grad student was presenting really cool work that kind of pushed back on a paper that had come out in economics that was one of those really cool on the surface natural experiments. And the findings that this student had were basically that if you make some slight adjustments to the data by knowing the area really well, everything falls apart. And I think that policy, without getting into, obviously too many details, the original paper was one that you might expect there to be very clear policy implications, very clear, here's how an NGO could get involved. Here's how, how intergovernmental organizations, et cetera, all these things could happen. And it just, to me, was a really great reminder of, even if we are really living up to the standards in the discipline of strict, causal interpretation of exactly the best practices on robustness, it may not always be the case that our findings are correct. And so for me, I think that one way to get around this would be to continue to talk to each other. So to have these sorts of conversations, and to try and make sure that when you are publishing, or when you're, looking at your findings, that you also address these with maybe organizations that are on the ground, that you perhaps engage them in your research process earlier rather than later, and certainly that you talk to one another about what are the implications and what are, cross methodological findings, I suppose.
That's so helpful, Chelsea. Thank you so much for that. And we'll finish this question with Emily. And Emily, you're muted.
Thanks. Chelsea really got at kind of the heart of what I really wanted to say here. And I think that that I had a lot of fear that I wasn't going to be able to speak to real world experience with my work, that kind of kept me from bridging the gap for a long time. And I think that it's important. There's a tension between knowing that you're not getting it all, right? You're not capturing it all with your research. You can't possibly do that. And being able to admit that and think about what that means, right? And so I think that it's really important for us when we're bridging the gap, whether that is because we're briefing policymakers, we are entering the public sector, the private sector or the public sector, or we are, writing blog posts, that we need to remember that we need to include stories and lived experiences more than I think a lot of us in the peace science community do, because we focus, as Chelsea said, so much on quantitative methods of inference. And I think that bringing more awesome people like Naz into that community will help us with that, right? So even if I don't do that field work, I could talk to Naz about hers. And so I think having conversations with people who study lived experiences, and then also with people who are, actually going out and protesting or voting or are involved in wars or peace processes, can really help inform how the research should be conveyed to policymakers. We just want to always be careful with elite to elite communications, because that can create spaces where your work doesn't actually consider its true impact. I also would, on this kind of broader risks question, want to hark back to something that Will Moore said when he was the president of Peace Science Society, that the words that we use have meaning. Like when we talk about migration, like it's a contagion, right? When we talk about contagion effects, it makes it seem like migrants are a disease, and that's not what we want to convey. So we want to think hard about the terms that we use, especially when we're not talking to other scholars, because what I mean when I'm saying things like contagion means something different when I'm talking to a room full of scholars than when I'm talking to migrants groups or people who make immigration policy. And so those things are something that we want to just be extra careful to attend to the words that we use. Another cost, kind of a more personal cost to engaging in bridging the gap, can be that if you're going to do it well, you have to learn how to do it. And that takes time, right? That means you go to IPSC, or you spend a summer hanging out in the State Department, or you do a fellowship. And it doesn't have to be any of those things, but it does take time to think about your work in a different way. It also takes time to learn how to communicate with those people. And so there's always, a time investment to figure out how to speak to your audience. Which we think is worth it.
Can I just pick up on that point, the last point that Emily made? And Danny, I'm going to be really rude and ask you a question. Is that okay? Because I think it not only takes time to learn how to do it. That's a really important point. It takes a huge amount of time to actually do it, to do it well, to be really engaged. And Danny, you've done so much, in terms of your work on hostage taking over the last year. You have to be, you're on call, and you have to, and so can you just say a little bit about that? Because I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Sure. And it segues to another conversation that I'm hoping to have as part of this. So I really appreciate it. So for anyone participating or watching this call, my research is all about hostage taking. Some of that is hostage taking by non-state actors, some is hostage taking by states. And so over the last year, I have done a lot of public and policy engagement with regard to state hostage taking that really became something that the media was interested in and the policymakers were talking a lot about after the arrest of Brittany Griner in Russia. And a lot of this really came out right after I attended IPSC with Chelsea and Emily, and learned how to do a lot of the things that one learns there. Like, you have a great media training and op-ed training and things like that. But there are a ton of questions about how to do that, and it does take a lot of time. So I had some research goals last summer, some papers that I was definitely going to submit, before September 1 that I just didn't get to because I was spending so much of my time doing this other thing. And I don't regret it at all. It was a very conscious choice that I made, which is that I felt in that moment that I wanted to contribute, and that it in some way it was service to contribute to the public and the policy conversation on this particular topic. It was a very deliberate and explicit choice that I made. Who knows if that's good strategically for my career, but it felt important to me. So that was just like personally what I wanted to do. But if you want to do press, if you're inclined to go on radio and podcasts and TV, you can't close down your email over the course of the day. You can't, kind of block off these long periods of deep work that I like to do when I'm writing, because if they email you and you don't get back to them within the hour, they find somebody else. And so, it's a constant question of, how quickly you're getting back to people, the preparation that one can do for an interview. I actually think that one can, and in my case, I think must prepare for these things. At some point you get a sense of what the questions will be, but you can figure out how you might want to address them. And then thinking, if what you're doing is not responding to requests, but instead writing things or reaching out to policymakers, then that is something that you control a little bit more with your time, but of course takes a lot of time. So that was basically my summer of 2022. So yeah, I'm looking at the clock. I see we've got 18 minutes left in our call. And so one thing that I will do is kind of open it up to our participants for questions. So if you want to either raise your hand to ask something or put something in the Q&A or chat, we will definitely call on you. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for any questions to come in, I might have one more quick question for our participants. I can ask more if we have more time, which is, when should someone engage? And I mean that question both kind of over the life of a project, research, over the life of your career, or as it, in my case, responding to a very pertinent current event. So I will start with Chelsea.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. So so first of all, I think you did such a fantastic job compiling these questions, and I'm so grateful for you putting this together. And I'll admit, when I looked at this one, I was like, "Ooh, I'm going to have very little to say on this because I don't know that I have the best advice. I think I'm going to probably leave it more to Naz and Emily and yourself, because I know that you have great experience in this aspect, Danny. But I think I would say, I would echo something that others on this call have said, which is don't wait. And if this is something, especially if this is just something that is personally important to you, I think often in academia, especially for those who are still in grad school, we're told, that there's a certain right way to do enough research or to do enough publications or to, just like buckle down and get things done. And that there's elements of that obviously ring true. But if you're not getting fulfillment out of this, why do it, right? So in a very kind of wishy-washy meta sort of way, if it's something important to you, I think that you should do it, with the ethical caveats, of course, that we've already mentioned about making sure perhaps you have run the research by someone who does work in a different methodological arena, or who does have really close connections to a specific community, or someone who's already, been implementing policy in a specific way. So I think if you've done your due diligence on what could be the harmful or the negative impacts, and it's something that is important to you, much as Danny said, I think it was not only personally important for her, as she mentioned about the last summer, but I think that the public and certainly policymakers got a lot out of her engagement as well. So I would keep that in mind, that the benefits may not just be, it's not just about how is this going to affect my tenure dossier. But as far as when to engage over the course of a project, this is something that I think the academic community, and I think Bridging the Gap is doing this really well. They're starting to sort of systematically look at this question and provide more advice. But I think in general, this is something that perhaps our programs need to do better for graduate students. I'd love more education on this as well. So, but, you know, I think this could range from, as you're applying for grants, right? As I think Emily mentioned earlier, and Naz confirmed, you know, what are going to be the conditions of a grant, and how can you really map that into what, you know, the time spent on both the application and then certainly on the use of the grant, what that's going to look like for you. How can you maximize being active and present with bridging while also it's going to be something that benefits whether or not you get the grant. And I think especially if you are prioritizing this, something that you can do is seek funding that, or seek partnership with an organization that is just going to explicitly have you, you know, sort of focus on how the work will be applied. So I've co-authored work where we're at very early stages talking to, you know, some folks from the World Bank, right? And so we know that there will be different limitations on what we can do with that partnership, but nonetheless, that feels exciting to me. That's something that I want to shape, you know, sort of the way that I do work. So I think it really comes down to, again, priorities. And then finally, the last thing I would say, you know, kind of that's more advice for the beginning of a project. Towards the end, I do think the more public engagement, blog posts, those sorts of things, my advice would be just write one for everything that you submit. Now, make them clear, make them, you know, again, all the same ethical implications apply, but it's super low cost. If it doesn't pan out, you still have a great way to talk about your research with people who may not use the same jargon. And if it does work out, you have a lovely little line to add to your CV. So that's my really straightforward advice.
That's great. I will turn it next to Naz, both to tackle that question. And we have our first question in the chat. So maybe if you want to address that one too, we can address that question, which is for conflict studies using historical data, how can we connect our research to the policy world? Perhaps one way is to show that historical events still have a lasting impact today. Is that enough? Could we do better? So you could take whichever questions you want.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just want to, you know, Chelsea, that was excellent advice. You said you didn't have much, but I thought that was absolutely fantastic. And I can, you know, very much agree with everything you said. You know, first and foremost, life's too short to not engage when you want to, right? So if you want to do it, do it. And you know, Bridging the Gap and many other organizations are here to kind of help you figure out how. I will just also mention Susanna Campbell, who is at the School of International Service at American University, and her work. She's partnered with Bridging the Gap through her research lab that's named Ripple, the Research on International Policy Implementation Lab. And she has this fantastic model of what she basically calls research co-creation. And it kind of gets to what you were just talking about, Chelsea, right? Which is about how, in Susanna's mind and the work that she's done, and I think this model really lends itself to peace and conflict studies, both quantitative and qualitative, and I'll get to the question in just a second, of really partnering from the outset in terms of research design with practitioners and with the interlocutors with whom you hope to have influence, right? And so Susanna and Jordan Tama, who's another co-director at Bridging the Gap, and I are actually under BTG putting together a series of modules for grad students and postdocs and maybe even faculty who are interested in kind of thinking through what this model looks like. And so just in terms of, you know, kind of future programming that we have coming out over the next few years, we're going to be working on this. But I would just again emphasize Susanna's perspective on this, which I very much share, is that bridging is not just disseminating research that you've already done to the rest of the world. It's about partnering with the communities in the world with whom you want to be in conversation. And that happens throughout the research cycle. And I just really like the way that she talks about it and thinks about it. So I wanted to just say that. In terms of the question, it's a great question. It's an important question. And I think that your answer is correct, in a sense, the answer that's embedded in the question. You know, policymakers reason by analogy, right? And Yuan Fun Kong has told us why that can be problematic. He has a piece in the same issue of International Affairs, I think also illustrated by Emily's company, you know, about how not to use historical analogizing with policymakers. But the kind of, you know, showing that historical events still have an effect into today in terms of charting those path-dependent kind of causal connections, in terms of showing how, you know, in a historical sense, how certain decision making affected the outcomes, and, you know, pointing out the sort of the parallel decision points and potential consequences today. I think that's a very powerful way of engaging with policymakers, you know, in particular in the executive branch, because they're making decisions sort of on the basis of, you know, they're making executive decisions, and so they want to know, how did other people make those executive decisions? But I think with, you know, going back to something that Emily said, how do we do this responsibly? We have to be able to sort of convey that information while still talking about the risks of analogizing, and so that's a tricky balance. But I think that's what I would suggest in response to the question, and I'm sure others have thoughts on that too.
Great, Emily.
I love what Naz just said about how policymakers think through analogy. It's also how students think, right? So we hear this in our classrooms all the time about, like, what is, you know, how do we know that this has this effect, or how do we know that this has, you know, different kinds of outcomes? And so I love that idea. And so I think everything that we do is really historical data. We can't, only us formal modelers are pretending we know what might happen in the future. And so I think that everything is historical data. And so I think that having that perspective is really important. To the prior question that Danny asked, I think that there are two kinds, well, there's many kinds, but there's two kinds of bridging, right? One is what Danny was describing, which is there's an event and we need to speak to it right now. Or like with the outbreak of the Ukraine war, there are things that happen, or there's a stock market change. There's lots of things that happen that are political in nature. And pundits and journalists and just everyday consumers want to know how to interpret that right at the beginning. And some people are really good at that. And also, I mean, as Danny said, that takes a lot of personal time. You can't just do that in an 8 to 5 work-life balance kind of way, right? And so some people can do that and other people don't. And maybe it's because you don't have the time, or maybe because you just don't want to or don't feel comfortable doing that. My preference for bridging the gap is to do it in a way that feels like I have the chance to prepare. And so, for instance, I might write policy implications of my work, knowing that the anniversary of this war is coming up, or that you know, this holiday is coming up and we need to think about Indigenous persons, or it's Women's Month and we need to think about them, and so forth. And so, like, there are lots of ways that you can engage that you have time, knowing that it's going to come. Or if it's something that happens every quarter, if you study economics or something like that, you can write it now and then just wait for that event and then throw it out there. And so there are ways to do it that allow you to have a little bit more preparation, I think, that are really useful. I would agree entirely with Chelsea that your project is better if you're thinking about how to bridge at every point of that project. But I also would encourage people to engage in interpreting current events or making policy recommendations, not just on the basis of their research, but on the basis of your expertise, right? I'm an international relations scholar. I wrote a book on human rights law, but that doesn't mean that I can't also speak on lots of different versions of the politics of international law. I teach that course, right? If I'm an expert enough to be able to teach that course, I'm also probably an expert enough to make a comment on it, or write a blog post on it that has nothing to do with my specific research. I think that we're often taught by our mentors to use op-ed writing or blog writing to bring attention to a project. And I find that to be the most annoying type of blog writing, because I want to know what all the political scientists say about a thing that is happening, right? What are the debates about this in the literature about this particular thing, which may not be something I've contributed to, but I will probably have still some expertise on it. And so I think that people should be encouraged to do more of that as well. And then you don't have to wait for your data to be processed or your survey to be finished if you're talking from your space of expertise and not from this particular research project.
That is such a great point. I love that. I think that most of my engagement is about my expertise and not about my research, actually. So I hadn't thought of it in those terms before. I think more about explainers than things like that. Chelsea, did you want to add anything to the question about historical data?
I think I would just second what or third rather, what my panelists have said. And I think also don't assume that just because you see your work or your methods as historical, that it's not also relevant and modern. So we had someone, and I'm unfortunately going to forget her name, but we had a historian with us at OPSC over the summer who worked on mostly on Russia, and she had really fantastic, deep contextual knowledge about various types of social and interpersonal and community relationships in Russia. And I think in one hand, she was sort of like, I didn't expect to be quite this relevant, right? And that's unfortunate in some ways, but it's also, I don't want to say you don't know when it's going to come back around, because that seems, kind of deeply cynical and kind of a weird way. But I would say don't sell the work that you are doing short for its implications, even for things where the analogy isn't immediately clear. I do think that the deep historical context that you are picking up on is incredibly valuable for fellow researchers, for policymakers, for, of course, as well for students. So I think I'll just end there and say that I think the advice that's already been given is sound advice.
Just to throw one more thing out there, I've been looking to write kind of a more trade press crossover book, and I've been looking at how publishers think about this. And I will say that most of the social scientists who are writing trade press books that everyone wants to read or that are at the top of the New York Times bestseller lists are historical books, right? They're written by history professors and talking about how history has meaning for today. So it's I would encourage you to really lean into it and bring it on, because we love learning about history.
I love that. We've got 2 minutes left. So I will just open it up to any of our panelists if there's anything else you want to add to this conversation, and maybe any of the questions that I had thrown out beforehand. Floor is yours.
Maybe, Danny, would you answer the question of where or how people should begin?
Sure. I'm happy to answer that question. So as a fellow with the Bridging the Gap Project, I would certainly always advise anybody who's interested to get in touch with the leadership team of the Bridging the Gap Project to apply to our programming if you are interested in attending. I think if you are interested in kind of any aspect of this, and whether that is advising policymakers or speaking to the public or working with NGOs in the policy generation process or anything like that, Bridging the Gap programming is a great way to think about that and to meet other scholars who are similarly interested in doing those kinds of things. And so you then build a network of people who can give advice. So our website is bridgingthegapproject.org. I think. bridgingthegapproject.org that Naz has already put in the chat. And we would love to see your applications for the New Era workshop, for the IPSC conference, which I thought was really tremendous. And I think it's been really great over the last handful of years since Bridging the Gap as an organization was started, that there have been so many public outlets that allow scholars to really translate their work to the public in different ways. And whether that's Sequential Potential, did I get that right, Emily? And Emily's amazing company, things like The Monkey Cage or Political Violence at a Glance, which are precisely looking for scholars to translate their work to the public. I think that's a great place to think, even if it's just writing for the public. I'm always happy to chat with anybody who wants to talk about these things. And we'll also say that if it's a question more about thinking about a career switch, Jim Goldgeier, who's one of the senior advisors of the Bridging the Gap Project, has just written a book with Tamara Wittes on careers to bridge the gap. Naz, do you have the title of that? Oh, and right, the Duck of Minerva. So Duck of Minerva, we actually have a Bridging the Gap channel on the Duck of Minerva, of which I am editor. So please send me your submissions for that.
I don't know the title, I'm afraid, but it's coming out with Georgetown University Press in the next few months, and we're going to do a webinar on it. It's a series of interviews with people who have PhDs from across a range of different disciplines who are working in alt-ac careers.
Excellent.
It's called Foreign Policy Careers for PhDs, a practical guide to a world of possibilities.
There you go. Thank you, Emily. So this brings us to the end of our hour of our conversation. Thank you all so much for attending and for viewing. Thank you so much to this just really superb panel of brilliant, interesting, thoughtful women. I'm so grateful for your work and for your friendship and for your willingness to contribute to the discipline in this way. So thank you so much, everybody, and look forward to speaking to you all soon.
Thanks for getting us together.
Thank
Danny,
you.
and thanks to Peace Science.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.